So those of you who are watching the recording, we've been talking about how we might not get all the way through 15 today because of the way the chapters are meant to be grouped. And Cheryl pointed out that this is the kind of book where it might be better to read the ending first. And I think she's got something, I think she's onto something there, because there's certainly, the book takes on new meaning when you are aware of where you're heading and what you're going to see at the end, which is, of course, the restoration and the unifying of heaven and earth, and all of that coming together. But before we begin, does anybody have any thoughts, questions, things that have gotten into your brain about this, especially as you've been reading some through Revelation? Okay, God love you then. You're stuck with me and my thoughts. Well, let's share my screen then. And right, and we will view from the current slide. No, I do not want. All right, everybody's got the full screen of the slideshow there? Perfect. All right, so we're picking up in Revelation chapter 11. And just to kind of remind us, last week we explored some of the more difficult and well-known material in Revelation. We talked about how John uses this dramatic imagery to point out the violence caused by unjust, corrupt systems of the world, by the empires of the world, specifically Rome. But he can't go out and just say Rome because, he's already hiding on an island from them. It's, not going to do him any good to say Rome out loud. And we're definitely going to see him use symbolism and imagery to say Rome without saying Rome. Tell me you're against the empire without telling me you're against the empire type stuff. And he's going to talk about that. We also talked a lot last week about how while we are often fascinated by the violence in the book of Revelation, and fixated on it, and while you do a lot of media, books, writings, artwork, I was telling somebody it's very challenging finding the artwork for this study because so much of it just hyper realizes the violence of this book, and that's not the point, because ultimately this is a book against violence. It's holding up the violence and corruption of earthly kingdoms, of human efforts, contrasting them with the image of God and the kingdom of God and what that is. So ultimately, the power and violence we see, we are supposed to be horrified from, turn from, and instead embrace the images of worship, of celebration, of healing, of restoration that we see scattered throughout the book, but especially at the end of the book. So that's just a reminder. Once again, I would encourage you not to lose hope as we get into these characters in these chapters. Again, this is intense stuff. We're going to be looking at, we've looked at the seven seals. We're going to get the cycle of the seven trumpets. And next week we'll get into the bowls, unless we get into 15 early. God has already told us that those who read these texts with the words are receiving a blessing. The point of this book, reading this book, is meant to be a blessing to you, and it is not to tell you to be overwhelmed by the corruption, violence, and hatred of the world, but to remember and see how God conquers it through love, acceptance, and honestly, just accepting and taking that violence into himself on the cross, and then resurrecting and saying, there is a power greater than your violence. See, you threw the worst I could at me. and behold, the Lamb who was slain has begun his reign. This is all very Revelation imagery, and there's a reason we sing that hymn or that praise song often in worship. Finally, we remember that apocalypses are about unveiling truth. There are several truths that John really wants to unveil here. The Pax Romana, the Roman peace, is not the truth of the world. And that peace is a false peace because it is achieved through violence and terror. John wants to reveal to people that God is not Rome, that Rome is not the true power in this world, but that God is the true power in this world, and encourage them to stay true to that. And we talked in the very first about how, John's not writing a book about, everybody respect everybody else's values here. He's saying, hey, your witness to the resurrection of Christ, that matters, and you can't just accommodate the rest of the world. You have to live your life like that matters, even if that puts you at odds with the world around you sometimes, culturally speaking. And again, the reason for that for Paul or for John of Patmos was because he did view the Roman world as entirely corrupt and doomed to fail. And he would probably say the same of any empire to this day. And ultimately, he's probably right. Human efforts don't necessarily lead us to lasting peace. We have yet to see an empire that reigned with peace and didn't collapse on itself throughout all of human history. What he's not calling them to do is to rise up in opposition as that Christian soldiers, onward Christian soldiers. He's not calling them to violence. He's calling them to witness. And that's going to be really key in these next parts of the book, as we're going to start with the two witnessings. We approach this book with hope. We keep in mind that Revelation is not meant to be read literally. This is symbolic, and we definitely want to remember that. We read it in a group, which is always good. Keep in mind the history and the motives of the author. We just talked a little bit about those, and we look for law and gospel in the text, because there's always both. Law is what God tells us to do for ourselves and each other. Gospel is what God promises to do for us, since we are not capable of doing it ourselves. And there is always both in Scripture. And just one last reminder, don't pay attention to the 7 seals, but the spiral, the seals, trumpets, and bowls are best thought of as a series of spirals. Each time telling the same sort of story. Oh, yay, Grace has joined us. Each time telling the same kind of story from a slightly different perspective as it spirals down to that one truth, or to those truths that John is attempting to reveal. All right. So let's get to looking at these texts. Last week we looked at the seals. That was the 4 horsemen, the martyrs that were under the altar, the earthquake where the sun, moon, and stars fell, the sealing of the 144,000, and the worship of the great multitude beyond measure and ability to count. And then the seals end with the silence in heaven, after which the trumpets start. And we went through the first of those. We saw the hail, the fire, and blood. We saw the fiery mountain crashing into the sea, and 1/3 of the sea becomes blood. We saw the stars falling, and 1/3 of the river turns into wormwood or has become undrinkable. We see, and you'll notice again, just like in the first 4 here, the first 4 in the seals are catastrophes. The first 4 here are catastrophes, life-altering catastrophes. that demonstrate the inability of empire to stand up to anything, that to stand up to the powers and forces of evil and corruption. Then we talked about the woe. Then we get into the wolves and the locusts in the dark pit, and those are really interesting and fun. But those are, again, fear, horror, things are coming apart, and then we are going to finish the trumpets with the witnesses and the celebration, as opposed to the seal cycle. Instead of the silence, it will be celebration. All right. Any questions about any of that? Okay. Seeing none, let's get to the two witnesses. So this is we're in here, and we're looking at Revelation 11. And John says, "Then I was given the measuring rod like a staff, and I was told, 'Come and measure the temple of God and the altar and those who are worshiping there. But do not measure the court outside the temple. Leave it out, for it is given over to the nations, and they will trample over the holy city for 42 months. And I will grant my two witnesses authority to prophesy for 1,260 days, wearing sackcloth. These are the two olive trees and the two lampstands that stand before the Lord of the earth. And anyone who wants to harm them, fire pours out of their mouths and consumes their foes. Anyone who wants to harm them must be killed in this manner. They have authority to shut the sky so that no rain may fall throughout the days of their prophesying. And they have authority over the waters to turn them to blood and strike the earth with every kind of plague as often as they desire." So, and this is kind of an interesting, this is from an illuminated text where we've got the witnesses and their death and their resurrection. It's a fascinating little bit of text. Hold on one second. All right. Someone's texting me. I was like, I'm teaching a Bible study now. I will text you back when I'm done. The temple in John equals the Christian community, and measuring them is another form of sealing them, similar to what we saw happen in Revelation 7 when the seal was given, a seal of protection. So John is given the measuring rod and being told to measure the Christian community or the temple as a place of protection. And then it talks about these two witnesses that are going to come and testify, and they're going to do it for 3.5 years. And they are going to finish their testimony, they're going to have the power to make sure that they're not cut off before their testimony is done, by either shutting up the sky, the fire coming from their mouths, kind of like saying the words. It's similar to the sword coming from the mouth of the lamb, or of Jesus. It's not the it's not so that he can be violent and use the sword. He's using his mouth. They're not being violent and burning things down. They're using their words, and their words are such that they are capable of overcoming any opponent. And then they have the power to, like other prophets of old, this would have made people think of Elijah and Elijah and other various prophets who shut up the sky. There was no rain that fell. There was no, they could turn the water to blood like Moses. It's to call up all these imagery of Old Testament prophets. Then, when they have finished their testimony, the beast that comes from the bottomless pit will wage war on them and conquer them and kill them. And their dead bodies will lie in the street of the great city that is prophetically called Sodom and Egypt, where also their Lord was crucified. That's one of those, tell me we're in Rome without telling me we're in Rome. He's falling off these terrible cities from the Bible that were destroyed, these empires that were overrun. And by the way, it's where our Lord was crucified. And of course, the Romans were responsible for that. For 3.5 days, members of the peoples and tribes and languages and nations will gaze at their bodies and refuse to let them be placed in a tomb. And the inhabitants of the earth will gloat over them and celebrate and exchange presents, because these two prophets tormented the inhabitants on earth. Again, their words, they're unable to refute their arguments. They're witnessing to the terror and corruptness of empire. They are calling and comparing that to the glory and the peace and the love of God, and no one else can stand in its wake, and people are just angry about it. And it's kind of like if you pictured the person that you can't stand to listen to talk, but you also can't really argue against their thoughts and opinions, and that they were died, and they're like, yes, that's kind of like the whole kingdoms are rejoicing and saying, look at that, they're finally done, they're gone. But after 3.5 days, the breath of life from God entered the two witnesses, and they stood on their feet. And those who saw them were terrified. Then they heard a loud voice from heaven saying to them, come up here. And they went up to heaven in a cloud while their enemies watched them. And at that moment, there was a great earthquake, and 1/10 of the city fell. 7,000 people were killed in the earthquake, and the rest were terrified and gave glory to God in heaven. The second woe has passed. The third woe is coming soon. So the beast is, of course, the power of Rome, and the forces of human arrogance and empire that defy God, and the forces of evil and wickedness that lead us to be arrogant and selfish and rely on empire instead of relying on God. But after they've killed, they are resurrected. And it's not after 3 days like Jesus. 3 is a perfect number. 3.5 is a number we're going to see a lot tonight. And it's a number you see a lot in apocalyptic literature, because it represents broken time or interrupted perfection. It's not the perfect number. It's not the perfect holy number. It's not the perfect earthly number 4. It's this in-between thing. And it usually symbolizes a time of intense persecution or suffering. So the witnesses are able to witness for 3.5 years, and that will 42 months, and that will lead them to times of great suffering. There will be a lot of unrest. They are dead for 3.5 days. We're going to see that again later on, as we envision some of the other things. Finally, we get to the 7th trumpet. The 7th angel blew his trumpet, and there were loud voices in heaven saying, the kingdom of the world has become the kingdom of our Lord and of his Messiah, and he will reign forever and ever. Then the 24 elders who sit on their thrones before God fell on their faces and worshiped him, saying, we give thanks, O Lord Almighty, who are and who were, for you have taken your great power and begun to reign. But your wrath has come, and the time for judging the dead, for rewarding your servants, the prophets and the saints, and all who fear your name, both small and great, and for destroying those who destroy the earth. When God's temple in heaven was opened, the ark of his covenant was seen within the temple. And there were flashes of lightning, rumbles, peals of thunder, an earthquake, and heavy hail. And somebody put something in the half the perfect number of 7. Very good, Cheryl. Yes, you're right. 3.5 is half of the perfect holy number of 7. So I hadn't put that one together. That was good. So the 7th trumpet sounds, and we have this declaration that now the kingdom of the world is over and the Lord is taking his power. So this concludes this cycle of the spiral. And the kings, the elders, the powers of the earth that were sitting before the throne of God in the beginning of the book have cast their crowns before the Lord, rejoice that he is given over. And there's also somewhat of a lament of the judgment that is coming. And that's a sign to us that we are not yet out of this cycle of terror and judgment. Now we're going to get into this really the heart of some of the most challenging parts of Revelations 12 through 19. And it's really important that we keep some key ideas in mind. Christ's victory on the cross. We're given the power to have victory over evil and unjust forces of the world through our witness, or by telling others of Christ's victory and living lives that reflect it. Every time we refuse to act with fear, with hatred, with judgment, every time we choose to act with love, with kindness, with hope, every time we do those things and reconnect them and say, I do this because I believe in the power of Christ, who lived and died and rose and showed me what power truly is. We are witnessing as John would want us to witness. Again, the violent imagery is not the point. We are to be nonviolent. That is part of our witness, even if, and John is very clear about this, not to say that we should go rush out and want to become martyrs, but even if doing so makes it harder for us to live in the world as we live in it today. Even if choosing to act with love and compassion and mercy puts us at odds with the world we are currently living in. And especially when, as we'll talk a little bit later on, we find that message, if you want to get into Paul, the foolishness of the cross and the strength of that. Any thoughts? So we're going to be looking at some key images in this time. We get the retelling of Christ's birth and victory. We get the dragon, Satan, or the opposition. We see Earth's victory. We see the two beasts from the sea, and we talk about Armageddon and the rapture. So let's start. Oh, please do remember, though, that these are not depictions of God's punishment and wrath. They are events that God grieves over. Just like the elders were saying, we're sad about the judgments and the wrath that will come. It talks about God pouring out his wrath upon the earth, but this isn't something that God is gleefully doing, saying, finally, I can give those nasty people theirs. It's saying this is what has become of the world because of its inability to walk with God and to witness to God and to follow God's ways. And these are the things that play out. The violence we see, the injustice, the hatred, it all plays out because we are not following in Christ's ways. It's not the action of a vengeful God. It is the violence that is born of empire and of our desire to continue to try to retain our own, to contain and be in power and control. So this section starts off with a retelling of the birth of Christ. And this is a well-known passage. Great portent appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun and the moon under her feet, and on her head was a crown of 12 stars. She was pregnant and crying out in birth pangs, in agony of giving birth. Then another portent appeared in heaven, a great red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns, and 7 diadems.
Oh, God, take it out. Take it out, honey. Just saying it out. See where it says the red thing? We dropped it. Sorry. I'm
No
sorry.
worries. You're fine. 7 diadems on his heads, and the tail swept down a third of the stars from the heaven and threw them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman who was about to bear a child, so that he might devour her as soon as it was born. And she gave birth to a son, a male child, who is to rule all the nations with an iron rod. But her child was snatched away and taken to God and his throne. And the woman fled into the wilderness, and she was placed with a place prepared by God, so that she can be nourished for 1,260 days. Again, that's that 42 months or 3.5 years. 3.5 has come up again. This is a retelling of a popular myth in Roman culture. Much like a pastor would use a popular movie to illustrate a point in our time, this is a retelling of the birth of Apollo. The woman is, we think of the woman as Mary, and that's the image that first comes to it, but it's not just Mary. She's a depiction of God's people, of all of those people who bear witness to Christ's victory and are victors themselves through the action. And the child she is about to bear is that victory, that witness of Christ. So there's 12 stars for 12 tribes. And the idea here is that Jesus is born of the people of God, and his victory is complete. We are witnesses to that victory. And then through that witnessing, we ourselves become victors. The dragon is modeled after the serpent from Genesis 3. And the dragon is given, it has the image to give powers to those that oppose God, like the upcoming persecutions and sufferings we are going to see. And the 7 heads is supposed to draw our attention to the 7 hills of Rome, that the 7 hills that Rome is built on. So once again, we're supposed to think Rome, but not say Rome, because that was the great empire of the day. I often wonder if John was writing this today, what imagery he would use. It's kind of a fascinating thing, but I can't go too far down that rabbit hole. I get lost in it real quick. Finally, the wilderness. There are many places in the Bible where God's people find refuge in the wilderness, and it's a place where God sustains and cares for their people. And it's also God being with them in wild and difficult times and places. Again, a time of persecution, the imperfect number, the 3.5 years. But they're not alone. They find God. After this, a war broke out in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought back. But they were defeated, and there was no longer any place for them in heaven. The great dragon was thrown down, the ancient serpent who is called the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the whole world. He was thrown down to the earth, and the angels were thrown down with him. Remember the deception in the Garden of Eden at the very first sin. That is, by taking the fruit and eating it, humanity will be like God. We will have the power of God to know good and evil, and there's a desire to have that so that we can determine our own lives and fate in the absence of God. This battle comes through. The serpent is finally defeated, the deceiver. That's why these images of the dragon, the serpent, the devil, Satan, the deceiver of the world, who said, you will be like God yourself, even though that clearly never works out, because if it was, we would have figured this out in the thousands of years.
A long time ago.
And then I heard a loud voice in heaven proclaiming, now I have come the salvation and the power and the kingdom of God. The author of his Messiah and the accuser of our comrades has been thrown down, who accuses them day and night before our God. But they have been conquered by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony, for they did not cling to life even in the face of death. So again, the thing that conquers the deceiver of this world, conquers the lies and the abuses and the corruption is the truth of Jesus, the blood of the Lamb, God's love, and the witness of those who continue to live that life witnessing to that truth, loving in the face of hatred, hoping for or working for life in the face of death, and continuing to do the good work of relying on Jesus in a world that continuously tries to make us pit ourselves against each other, fight against each other, reject each other, and even become in and do violence against each other. This again is in between times. This is part of the victory of Jesus, that he's been thrown out of heaven, but of course that means he's been thrown down to the earth. And while he no longer rules, he has not been cast out of creation or earth just yet. So we are still living with this. Some people use this text to talk about Satan having being the fallen angel, saying the serpent in the garden was the fallen angel, but it's worth noting that that story was written literally thousands of years before this one, and probably while John is definitely using inspiration from the Genesis tale here, this isn't proof necessarily of the Genesis tale, especially since it refers to Jesus's life, death, and resurrection, which means this couldn't be the serpent from the garden. He's just kind of drawing the connection, or saying you can't say that there's a heavenly battle in the angel got thrown down and that was Genesis, and it just doesn't really work. But there's this beautiful song of hope to those who suffer persecution, that evil may rule temporarily, but has ultimately been defeated by the blood of the Lamb and the witness of those who follow him, which is really powerful and really meaningful. Then we return back to the woman. The dragon saw that he had been thrown down to earth, so he pursued the woman who had given birth to a male child. But the woman who had been given 2 wings of a great eagle, so that she could fly from the serpent into the wilderness, to her place where she was nourished for a time and times and half a time. So that's 3.5 again. That's another way of saying the 3.5. Then from his mouth the serpent poured water like a river after the woman to sweep her away with a flood, like the flood swept away everything in Noah's time. Going all the way back to the classics with this. But the earth came to the help of the woman. It opened its mouth and swallowed the river that the dragon had poured from its mouth. And the dragon was angry with the woman and went off to make war on the rest of her children, those who kept the commandments of God and hold the testimony of Jesus. So this is a fascinating image. You see the sun that she's born here, the eagle's wings. You see the dragon with the river being swallowed up by the mountains on the earth, and then the beast going to make war against the Christians, those who are following her. And we remember again, the woman is the church, the Christian community at large. So her children would be those who are part of that community. It's also really interesting here that we see Earth playing an actual role in the narrative. The Greek noun for Earth is feminine, it's Gi or Gaia. And a direct translation of this text could be Earth opened her mouth and swallowed the river that the dragon has poured from his mouth. Could be a callback to the Exodus story where the earth swallows the Egyptian army and throws them from the Red Sea. Or, like I said, a kind of interrupted version of Noah's flood where they're trying, the dragon, the devil, the forces that defy God are trying to decimate the earth, but God will not allow that to happen. Instead, the earth becomes a participant in saving creation. And this is really important because it shows the value that earth has in the cosmic story. God is not just going to abandon and destroy the earth, which is something that many people who believe in the rapture think. You'll hear a lot of people who don't care for environmental practices say, well, what does it matter? God's going to destroy this version of creation anyway, which is a really... I lost you guys. All right, sorry about that. I think we're back though. Let me start my video. That was weird. There we
Yeah,
go.
it just froze.
Yeah, no, we lost internet for a second. So let me get back to the shared screen. But we were talking about how the earth is not an unimportant character in creation. Rather, the earth is something of value that God will continue to protect and value. It's not something disposable, and God is not just going to throw it away at the end of creation. Rather, it will be restored. Then we get to the beasts from the sea and the land. So in Revelation 13, I saw a beast rising out of the sea, having 10 horns and 7 heads, and on its horns were 10 diadems, and it and on its heads were blasphemous names. And the beast that I saw was like a leopard. Its feet were like a bear's, and its mouth like a lion's mouth. And the dragon gave its power and its throne to great authority. One of the set heads seemed to have received a death blow, but its mortal wound had been healed. In amazement, the whole earth followed the beast. They worshiped the dragon, for he had given his authority to the beast. And they worshiped the beast, saying, "Who is like the beast? And who can fight against it?" Let any one of you has ear listen. If you are taken captive, into captivity you go. If you kill with the sword you must be killed. Here is the call for the endurance and faith of the saints. So this again is where he is calling them to stand up and resist the powers of empire and authority. This first beast from the sea, and I love this because you see the dragon handing the scepter of power over to the beast from the sea. This is an old manuscript. But John is calling attention to the corrupt powers of empire. There are two beasts based on Jewish teachings that God created two great beasts, one of the land, the behemoth, and one of the sea, the Leviathan. So the beast from the sea combines the sea monster imagery with beasts that Daniel used to describe various empires in his prophecy. And it ties it all to Rome again, mentioning 7 heads, 7 hills, and the beast conquers through sword and death. But it is only for a short time, for 3.5 years. Again, that imperfect number. And his rule is a pale imitation of the power of Christ, who rules through love. And that love is what he demonstrates through his own death, and the power that comes when he overturns it and is resurrected and will not be defeated by the powers of death. Then we get the second beast. I saw another beast rose out of the earth, and it had 2 horns like a lamb, and it spoke like the dragon, and it exercised all the authorities of the first beast on its behalf. And it makes the earth and all its inhabitants worship the first beast, whose mortal wound has been healed. It performs great signs, even making fire come down from heaven to earth with the sight of all. And by the signs it is allowed to perform on behalf of the beast, it deceives the inhabitants of the earth, telling them to make an image for the beast that has been wounded by the sword and yet lived. And it was allowed to give breath to the image of the beast, so that the image of the beast could even speak and cause those who would not worship the image of the beast to be killed. Also, it causes both small and great, rich and poor, both free and slave, to be marked at the right hand or the forehead, so that no one can buy or sell who does not have the mark, that is, the name of the beast or the number of its name. This calls for wisdom. Let anyone with understanding calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a person. Its number is 666. So this is interesting. Again, the beast from the sea has come out. It has been given power by the dragon, and people follow it because of its overwhelming dominance and sheer force. And then we get the second beast, who comes up and becomes a false prophet. It's able to perform miracles. It's able to make the image of the beast appear like it's talking. It's able to make it seem like this is the holy and right thing to do. And it's a sort of a corrupt Holy Spirit coming along the earth, encouraging the worship of the culture of empire or the first beast or the dragon. And they encourages people to embrace it, and especially through this economic practice of making sure a lot of people in Rome were unable to participate in trade guilds or things like that because they didn't participate in the cult of pagan worship that those guilds relied upon. If your trade guild worshipped Athena because you were in a trade guild that used olive oil and she was the goddess of that, and you refused to offer patronage or tribute to her in any kind, then you couldn't be a part of the trade guild and it would be very difficult to make your living. So that's kind of what they're saying, is that people who choose not to participate in the economic systems of the empire struggle, and it corrupts the story to make it seem like the beast is God. And I often think about our own struggle and narrative with Christian nationalism. And that's not saying conservative Christianity versus liberal Christianity. That's not what I'm talking about here, but rather Christian nationalism, which really looks at the gospel and tries to say, God created America to be a city on a hill. Well, God didn't create America. America is another empire that rose to power, and we'll see how it goes. Just like the British Empire and the Roman Empire and the Persian Empire and the Egyptian Empire and the Assyrian Empire and every other empire out there in the world. But we mostly like to try and tell ourselves, well, we're the chosen people and we're the good empire. And Revelation is a book that reminds us that it's not God's kingdom, so it's not our ultimate truth or fate. And it probably can't fully give us what we want or need like God can and will. So then we get to, and finally, I have to address the 666. This is a number. It is not an evil number. In fact, hymn 666 is what wondrous love is this in our hymnal. It's not a bad number. 6 is an incomplete or imperfect number. It shows that the powers of the beast do not even come close to being perfect like the power of God. But there was also a tradition of, and this is where I think this really comes in. It says, this calls for wisdom. You're supposed to think about this next line. The number of the beast is a person. And numerically, if you look at the alphanumeric codes that were used at that time, you can spell out the name of Emperor Nero, who was the first emperor of Rome to severely persecute the Christian faith, and would have been doing that shortly before John is writing this gospel or writing this book and this letter. So the mark of the beast is the Emperor Nero. And again, we get that because he's saying this calls for wisdom. This is a person, don't participate in his kind of thinking. Stand up to it, witness, and act with courage and love and hope in the face of conquering and death. And to show what that looks like, we get into 14 where we say the lamb and the 144,000 gathered around the throne again. Then I looked, and there was the Lamb standing on Mount Zion, and with him were 144,000 who had his name and his father's name written on their foreheads. So this is being sealed. So this is, again, a different kind of mark and a different kind of being sealed. And I heard the voice from heaven like the sound of many waters, like the sound of loud thunder. The voice I heard was like the sound of the harpists playing on their harps. And they sing a new song before the throne and before the four living creatures and before the elders. No one could learn the song except the 144,000 who had been redeemed from the earth. It is those who have not defiled themselves with women, for they are virgins. These follow the Lamb wherever he goes. They have been redeemed from humankind as first fruits of God and the Lamb, and in their mouths no lie was found, for they are blameless. So you kind of get this utopian image of people and the witness and the people you are supposed to follow, as opposed to following these beasts right in the middle of these really jarring and tragic tales. You get this
Pastor,
beautiful, yes,
I'm sorry. Are all of the 144,000 then men who have not defiled
probably.
themselves with women?
Yes, most likely. Although this artist's depiction does have a group of women over here, but most of them are men. And it's interesting, this is a medieval piece. And it's interesting, I bet if you looked and we really broke this down, you'd find depictions of popes and priests and men that were deemed holy and righteous in their era. So the saints, so to speak, before the throne. Um, and the 144,000 is the multiple of 12 again, which is a number for wholeness, completeness. You know, we get the complete image of goodness and worship as opposed to the incomplete image of violence and following the beasts of the world. Great question, Alan. And into this, we get the message of the angels. And I saw the other angel flying in mid heaven, and the eternal gospel to proclaim to those who live on earth, to every nation and tribe and language of people. He said in a loud voice, "Fear God and give him glory, for the hour of his judgment has come, and worship him who made heaven and earth and sea and springs of water." Then a second angel, and the second angel followed, saying, "Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. She has made all the nations drink wine of wrath of her prostitution." Then another angel, a third, followed him, crying out, "Those who worship the beast and its image and receive the brand on their foreheads or on their hands, they will drink the wine of God's wrath, poured unmixed into the cup of his anger. They will be tormented with fire and sulfur in the presence of the holy angels and in the presence of the Lamb, and the smoke of their torment goes up forever and ever. There is no rest day or night for those who worship the beast and its image, and for those who receive its brand on their name. Here calls for endurance of the saints, those who keep the commandments of God and hold fast to faith. So this is, again, this image of what we get when we pursue empire. And I think it's really interesting that they say there is no rest, there is no escape, there is no winning the game when you're worshiping the beast, because there's always more. There's always more money, more power, more doubt. There's always, you can always work harder, you can always be better. You are never enough when you're worshiping the beast. But when you're worshiping God, you do find those things, and you do find that rest. And so the angels are proclaiming that the beasts are going to fall, that there is no wealth or there is no promise in the future. There is no future with them. And you hear this voice saying, "Write this, blessed are the dead who from now on die in the Lord. Yes, says the Spirit, they will rest from their labors, for their deeds follow them." So rest is instead found and given from those who follow the Lord, even if they have died following the Lord for whatever reason, but likely a lot of people were being martyred at this time. So, and a lot of people would say, that looks like a really stupid thing to do. Why would we follow God when it's going to lead to our deaths? And so John is trying to encourage them to be steadfast, a call to endurance of the saints, saying, listen, God sees you, God knows you, your witness matters. And even if you die, you are still blessed in a way that those who worship empire are not. Chapter 14 ends with this great image of bringing in the harvest. Then I looked, and there was a white cloud, and seated on the cloud was one like a son of man, with a golden crown on his head and a sharp sickle in his hand. Another angel came out of the temple, calling with a loud voice to one who sat on the cloud, use your sickle and reap, for the hour to reap has come, because the harvest of the earth is fully ripe. So the one who sat on the cloud swung his sickle over the earth, and the earth was reaped. And then another angel came out of the temple of heaven, and he too had a sharp sickle. Then another angel came out from the altar, and the angel who had authority over fire, and he called with a loud voice to the one with the sharp sickle, use your sharp sickle and gather the clusters of the vine of the earth, for its grapes are ripe. So the angel swung his sickle over the earth and gathered the vintage of the earth and threw it into the great winepress of the wrath of God. And the winepress was trodden outside the city, and blood flowed through the winepress as high as the horse's bridle for a distance of about 1,600 stadia. So this is that wine, that luxury item, that symbol of empire and celebration, being used instead again as an image of war and death. God is gathering in, and the grapes of wrath, this is where that comes from, that this is where that saying comes from, for the grapes of wrath. That is the result, that is the harvest of empire. That is the result of what we have grown in our worship and love for empire. And it leads to this horrible image, the blood that flows as high as a horse's bridle, the death that comes out. And again, it's this imperfect number and image, but it's powerful and big. And this, I know this. There it is. And I want to end by saying a lot of times people look at this particular part of Revelation and really think it's the rapture theology. God's picking up those who deserve to be saved and punishing those who deserve to be punished and have their wrath poured out against them. This idea of a holy war, and we'll see it when we get into Armageddon. It's us versus them kind of thinking that is fueled by empire, and rapture and violence are actually more closely aligned with the thinking of empire than they are with biblical truth. It's one of the most harmful ideas, and it uses this book as a basis, particularly scenes like this. Rapture theologians do something called proof texting. They take small portions of scripture and interpret it outside of context of the rest of the Bible. And it gives their teaching the feel of being biblically true without it being anything that the Bible actually supports. Barbara Rossing, who wrote one of my favorite books, The Rapture Exposed, says, "We are not playing a game of biblical hopscotch," claims Hal Lindsey. Yet it is hard to call it anything else when he and other dispensationalists jump from one Bible verse to another to piece together their chronology of the rapture. They use the image of buried treasure, claiming that God has hidden individual rapture verses here and there in the Bible, similar to burying a treasure. And they turn it into this quest to decipher, uncode, and uncover what all of this is about. If rapture theology isn't biblical, where does it come from? It doesn't find its roots in the Bible, but in the teachings of an evangelical preacher named John Nelson Darby. And it's based on the vision of a 15-year-old girl named Margaret MacDonald when she was attending a healing service in England in 1830. Darby was convinced that Jesus would return in two stages, and he believed the first stage would be a rapture-like event in which true believers would be removed from the earth prior to the pain and horrors that would come in the years following. Then, after 7 years of strife, outlined in the book of Revelation, Jesus would come for a second time to truly defeat evil and establish a kingdom on earth for 1,000 years. This is the theology of a man not the theology of a sacred book. And it's important for me to say that because it is so pivotally and foundationally linked in our culture. I'm not saying that Christ won't come again. Christ will come again. I believe in the eschatology, in the return of Christ. What I don't believe in is a rapture in which some people are spared, some people suffer, and we see this violence played out upon the earth, or in which we have to make things happen, like restoring Jerusalem or something like that, which has I mean, people have made political choices in an effort to make Armageddon and the rapture happen. That's how harmful and dangerous this kind of thinking can be, because it leads us to the idea that we can be in control of it. So I'm going to end our time there and say that next week we're going to look at chapters 15, 16, 17, and maybe 19, depending on how far we get. Oh, nope. I want to bring this back to full screen and stop my share. And before we hang up, are there any questions, comments, thoughts? I know we've gotten into some heavy and dark stuff tonight.
I have one.
Yeah, Sue.
Why do some people think that 666 is so evil? I don't understand it.
And that's a good question. Again, it comes from a misunderstanding. They look at this and they see it as the mark of the beast, and they miss the clue that he's referring to a person. And so they think, oh, this is the mark of the devil, and that mark is going to come out someday. You may have heard, like, when vaccines came out, people were saying that's the mark of the beast, or credit cards or barcodes. These are the marks of the beast. And if you participate in them, you are somehow being corrupted by the world around us. I don't think God is as concerned about vaccine scars. I particularly polio, which left a scar when you got the vaccine. That was a huge upcry then.
Oh,
It does also make very good movie drama. You are correct, Cheryl. It does make for great imagery and good selling books, and it's a good movie plot.
yeah.
But
Okay.
but yeah, that's it. It's basically a misunderstanding and then a dramatization of this passage,
Oh, okay.
which
Thank
is
you.
kind of disturbing when we see how
Yeah.
easy it is for us to lose sight of biblical truth in order for how the world interprets that biblical truth.
Right. Thank you.
No, thank you. It's a great question.
Pastor, I'm curious about Egypt and
Ah,
how the word Egypt as relating to empire continues to come up within the book of Revelation,
yep.
and how whether or not the end times involve what we know as the nation of Egypt, or if that's just another symbol.
It's another symbol. It's meant to make us think of the Exodus. So when we hear Egypt, we're meant to think Exodus. When we hear Babylon, we're meant to think of the prophets and when the people were taken into exile. They're empires that biblically played a role in great suffering of God's people and God's followers. And and again, that image again, then you'll hear a lot of people who want Revelation to be a roadmap for the end of the world. They will tease that stuff apart and they'll say, oh, look, there's uprisings in Egypt. Egypt is about to fall. If the kingdom of Egypt falls, then we must be closer. That's not what he's saying at all. He's John wasn't thinking that 2,000 years from now, from when he was writing, there will be a kingdom and a nation of Egypt that has to be collapsing for God to come back. He was saying thousands of years before I'm writing, there was a kingdom of Egypt under which our people were oppressed, and God drew them out and saved them. And we are called to be witnesses and have faith like the people of the Exodus, like the people of Babylon in the exile, like the disciples following Christ, and the early Christian church. Another really good question. Thank you, Ellen. Cheryl.
I just can't help but thinking, and I know that I have a tendency to go as the crow flies. I like to go, from here to here without a lot of this. I like to come up with a simple kind of answer. But as we're going through this and I see all of the references from the Old Testament, and
Yep.
I mean, huge amounts of references constantly going through. To me, it just I came across this feeling that, wow, this is a pretty great summation of the Bible.
It
And
is.
here it is at the end. And like all of this is kind of like done in a fanciful way,
Yep.
but yet, and it's all very relevant with like Nero, the Greek letters, and Nero's name being 666, and
Yep.
all of that. That's pretty amazing coincidence. I just don't see that as a coincidence, but I do feel this is like an awesome, okay, guys, I'm going to give it to you from beginning to end in one fanciful sort of summation.
And you're right. There's a reason this is the last book of the Bible, and it does do this. In fact, one of the things I've always found really interesting, when we get to the end, we're going to see how it bookends. The Bible begins and ends with this garden and with this tree and with this light, and that's deliberate. John is using all these imagery, and it is, I mean, that's the divine inspiration happening. And yeah, he's telling the story of God's people again, and telling it to the future Christian followers to say, you are also part of this story now, and you are called to continue to witness and stand firm in telling that story.
Right.
And letting
Pastor,
God guide you for that. Yeah.
Pastor, is there any imagery or stories or connection to any of the Apocrypha within the book of Revelation?
Yes. Enoch, the two
Oh,
witnesses.
it's interesting. I've seen a lot like on Facebook right now about the book of Enoch, and some folks are getting really riled up about the book of Enoch.
Yes, they are. And Enoch is an interesting book of the Bible. It's an interesting apocryphal book. Apocrypha, by the way, does not mean false or anything like that. It's extra biblical. It's books that.
It's the stuff that St. James, or that the King James version didn't include, right?
Yeah. Well, and it's stuff that to be included in the Bible, you needed to be part of biblical canon, you needed to pass kind of three tests. There had to be ancient, meaning they came from the 1st century or earlier. Pretty much anything written after the year 100 to 110 was considered to be too modern and too far removed from Jesus's time. It had to be relevant in more than one community. It had to have relevancy, meaning it couldn't just be that the people in this pocket of the Christian world thought this was a great book. People from all different pockets of the Christian world needed to find meaning in that work, that letter, or that gospel. And it had to have consistency, which was it had to fit with the rest of the story. The infancy gospel of Thomas is a great example. That's not part of the gospel because he makes Jesus's birth seem like a Greek god, where there's a story in there where Jesus is supposedly playing with kids, and they say, we'd rather be dead than play with you. And Jesus says, okay, and they fall down dead. And then the parents go and complain to Joseph, and Joseph comes up and says, really? And Jesus says, fine. And they all rise back to life. That's what happens in the stories of Greek and Roman gods, not what fits with the Jesus. So clearly that wasn't cohesive with the rest of the unit. I'm assuming that the Old Testament was pretty well established by the time the New Testament was written, but I'm assuming they would have had similar guidelines. And Enoch, it just, yeah, I'm not exactly sure of the thing for that, but I know as later scholars looked at it and looked at canon, those were the things that they looked at. But Enoch, the two witnesses, a lot of people think that the two witnesses could be Enoch and Elijah, because They were the two people in the Old Testament that didn't physically die. Their bodies were taken directly up into heaven, and therefore they were returning from heaven as God's prophets and witnesses.
Interesting. Thank you.
It is. No worries. Yeah. You guys are good tonight. Anything else? Thank you all so much. We'll look at chapters 15 through 19 next week. And then we'll go from there and finish the book of Revelation off on the following week. And then it'll be time for Lent. So thank you, everyone. I appreciate you being here. I love the questions. Keep it going. And if you're watching it later in the week, thank you so much. Tell us what you think. Ask questions. We love seeing you. Let me end the recording.